They say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Well, they threw Sarah Mitchell from a helicopter into a storm, and somehow, against every possible odd, she survived. Now she's about to show them exactly how strong that made her. This is the story of betrayal, survival, and the kind of justice that refuses to stay buried. Welcome to Voice of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notification. Comment where you're watching from and your view on the story. Thank you. Sometimes I wonder what goes through a person's mind when everything they believed in crumbles in a single moment. When trust becomes betrayal. When heroes become villains. This is Sarah Mitchell's story, and I promise you, it's one you won't forget. Sarah was the kind of woman you'd want on your side in any fight. 34 years old, a captain in the Air Force, and one of the best helicopter pilots the military had ever seen. She'd flown rescue missions in war zones, pulled soldiers out of burning buildings, and saved more lives than she could count. Her uniform was decorated with medals that told stories of courage most of us can't even imagine. But on that cold November night, flying through a storm over the Atlantic Ocean, none of that mattered anymore. The rain was coming down so hard it sounded like bullets hitting the metal helicopter. Thunder rolled across the sky, and lightning turned everything white for just a second before plunging them back into darkness. Sarah sat in the back of that aircraft, her hands cuffed behind her, her ankles bound together. Her flight suit was soaking wet, clinging to her skin, but the cold she felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold of betrayal. Around her sat 5 men. Men she'd flown with for years. Men she'd trusted with her life. Lieutenant Mike Anderson, who used to joke around during long flights. Sergeant Tom Bradley, who'd once told her she was the best pilot he'd ever known. Captain Dave Wilson, who'd saved her a seat in the mess hall more times than she could remember. Not one of them would look at her now. Their eyes were fixed on the floor, on the walls, on anything but her face. And in their shame, Sarah could see the truth. They knew what was about to happen. They knew it was wrong. But they were going to let it happen anyway. Sitting across from her, staring right at her with cold, empty eyes, was the man who'd ordered all of this. Colonel Richard Hayes. For 20 years, he'd been climbing the ranks, building his reputation, shaking hands with powerful people. And for the last 3 years, he'd been selling military secrets to the highest bidder. Sarah had found out. It started small, like these things always do. A mission that didn't make sense. Flight plans that got changed at the last minute with no explanation. Equipment that went missing from secure facilities. Most people would have ignored it, chalked it up to military bureaucracy. But Sarah wasn't most people. She started asking questions. Started digging through files she probably shouldn't have been looking at. And what she found made her sick to her stomach. Colonel Hayes and 3 other senior officers were running an operation that sold classified military information to private military contractors and foreign buyers. They were making millions while putting soldiers' lives at risk. Flight routes, security protocols, weapon shipments. All of it for sale to anyone with enough money. Sarah had collected evidence. Copied files. Recorded conversations. She was going to turn it all in to the Inspector General's office the next morning. But someone had tipped off Colonel Hayes. "You should have minded your own business, Captain," Hayes said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. He stood up, gripping a metal bar to steady himself as the helicopter shook. "You were a good pilot. You could have had a great career." Sarah looked up at him, rain dripping from her hair into her eyes. "And you were supposed to be a good officer," she said. Her voice was steady, even though her heart was pounding. "You took an oath to protect this country. Instead, you sold it out for money." Hayes's jaw tightened. For just a second, something that might have been guilt flickered across his face. But then it was gone, replaced by cold determination. "Open the door," he ordered. Tom Bradley's hand hesitated on the latch. Sarah saw it, that moment of doubt. But then Mike Anderson stepped forward and yanked the door open himself. The wind exploded into the cabin like a wild animal. It howled and screamed, bringing with it sheets of freezing rain that soaked everyone instantly. The helicopter tilted, fighting against the storm. Through the open door, Sarah could see nothing but darkness and churning ocean far below. This was really happening. Hayes grabbed her by the arm and dragged her toward the opening. Sarah's boots scraped against the metal floor as she tried to find traction, but with her hands and feet bound, there was nothing she could do. "Please," Dave Wilson said suddenly. His voice cracked. "Please, sir, there has to be another way." Hayes didn't even look at him. "There is no other way. She knows too much." Sarah's mind was racing. She thought about her father, who'd been a pilot before her. He died in a crash when she was 16, but she remembered what he used to tell her. Fear is just information, baby girl. It tells you you're alive. What you do with it, that's what makes you who you are. She wasn't going to die begging. She wasn't going to give Hayes that satisfaction. As he pushed her closer to the edge, she looked him straight in the eye. You think this ends with me? She said. I left copies of everything. People who will ask questions when I disappear. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. It was a lie. She hadn't had time to make copies. But she wanted him to spend the rest of his life wondering if it was true. Hayes's expression didn't change. Goodbye, Captain Mitchell. And then he pushed. For one impossible moment, Sarah was suspended in the doorway, between the helicopter and the void. Lightning flashed, and she saw her reflection in the rain. A woman in uniform, betrayed by the very people she'd sworn to serve alongside. Then gravity took her. She fell. The wind tore at her clothes and skin. The rain felt like needles. The sound of the helicopter's rotors faded as she dropped through the storm, spinning, helpless, bound hand and foot. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have screamed. But Sarah's training kicked in, that muscle memory from years of emergency simulations. She tucked her chin to her chest, pulled her knees up as much as the restraints allowed, and tried to control her spin. She couldn't see the ocean below. Everything was just darkness and rain and the terrible rushing of wind. Her lungs burned. Her heart felt like it was going to explode. But in that moment, falling through the storm with death waiting below, Sarah Mitchell made herself a promise. If she survived this, somehow, someway, she was going to make them pay. Not just Hayes, but everyone involved. She was going to expose what they'd done and make sure the whole world knew the truth. The ocean came up fast. Too fast. Sarah took one last deep breath, tilted her body to try to hit the water feet first, and then, impact. The ocean hit her like a concrete wall. Pain exploded through every part of her body. The force knocked the air from her lungs and sent her tumbling deep into the dark water. The cold was shocking, numbing, squeezing her chest like a vice. She couldn't tell which way was up. The cuffs on her wrists dug into her skin. Her lungs screamed for air. The ocean pulled at her, dragging her down into darkness. This is it, a voice in her head whispered. This is how it ends. But another voice, deeper and stronger, her father's voice, said, Not yet, baby girl. Not yet. Sarah kicked. With her ankles bound, it was almost impossible, but she kicked anyway. She fought against the weight of her wet uniform and boots. She fought against the cold and the pain and the voice that told her to just let go. Her head broke the surface. She gasped, sucking in air and seawater, coughing, choking, but alive. Thunder rumbled overhead. The storm was still raging, waves lifting her up and dropping her down like she weighed nothing. Through the rain, she could just barely see the helicopter's lights, already distant, already leaving her behind. They thought she was dead. They thought the ocean would hide what they'd done. They were wrong. Sarah floated on her back, trying to conserve energy, trying to think. Her wrists were still cuffed, but the impact had loosened one of the links. She twisted her hands, ignoring the pain as the metal cut into her skin. Blood made her hands slick, but it also made them slide easier. Come on, she told herself. Come on, Sarah. You didn't survive that fall just to drown now. With one final wrench that sent white-hot pain shooting up her arms, her right hand slipped free of the cuff. She immediately went to work on her ankles, her numb fingers struggling with the restraints. The waves kept pushing her under, and twice she had to stop to fight her way back to the surface, but finally, the ankle restraints came loose. She was free. Hurt, exhausted, freezing, and alone in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean during a storm, but free. Through the darkness and rain, she saw something. A faint light in the distance. A boat, maybe. Or just lightning playing tricks on her oxygen-deprived brain. She started swimming. Every stroke felt impossible. Her muscles screamed. Her ribs, probably cracked from the impact, sent sharp pains through her chest with every breath. But she kept swimming toward that light, because what else was there to do? Give up? Let Hayes win? Not a chance. The storm began to ease. The rain softened from an assault to a steady drizzle. The waves grew smaller, and that light grew closer, more distinct. It was real. Some kind of boat or platform. Sarah's vision was starting to blur when her hand hit something solid. Metal. She grabbed onto it, a piece of floating debris. Looked like part of a shipping container that had been torn loose by the storm. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her afloat while she rested. She clung to that piece of metal as the storm finally broke and the first gray light of dawn crept across the sky. In the distance, she could see land. Rocky cliffs rising out of the ocean, dark and forbidding. But to Sarah Mitchell, floating half-dead in the Atlantic, those cliffs looked like the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She started swimming again. Slower now, her body running on pure willpower. The sun rose higher, warming her frozen skin. Seabirds circled overhead, their cries echoing off the rocks. When her feet finally touched sand, Sarah almost cried. She crawled onto the beach, collapsing on the wet sand, coughing up seawater, her whole body shaking. She was alive. Against every odd, against all logic, she was alive. She lay there for a long time, listening to her heartbeat, feeling the sun on her face. Somewhere above her, on those cliffs, she could see the outline of a small building. A fishing shack, maybe. Somewhere to get warm and dry. Somewhere to start figuring out her next move. Sarah pushed herself to her hands and knees. Her body protested, every muscle aching, but she ignored it. She'd survived falling from a helicopter in a storm. She'd survived hitting the ocean at terminal velocity. She'd survived swimming miles to shore with broken ribs. She could survive whatever came next. As she stood on shaking legs and started walking toward those cliffs, the sun broke fully through the clouds. The storm was over. But for Colonel Richard Hayes and everyone who'd helped him, Sarah Mitchell's storm was just beginning. You ever had one of those moments where you're so exhausted you can barely think straight, but your mind won't let you rest? That's where Sarah was as she climbed those cliffs. Every step sent pain shooting through her body. Her ribs screamed with each breath. Her hands were torn up from the handcuffs and covered in salt water that made every cut burn like fire. But she kept climbing. The fishing shack she'd seen from the beach turned out to be more of a shed. A little wooden building that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The door hung crooked on rusty hinges, and half the roof was missing. But to Sarah, it might as well have been a five-star hotel. She stumbled inside and immediately collapsed against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the dusty floor. For the first time since being thrown from that helicopter, she let herself feel it. All of it. The fear. The pain. The betrayal. She was supposed to be dead. Hayes and his men were probably already filing reports, telling everyone that Captain Sarah Mitchell had been killed in a tragic training accident. They'd make up some story about equipment failure or pilot error. There'd be a memorial service. Her name would go on a wall somewhere, and everyone would move on, never knowing the truth. That thought made her angry. And anger, Sarah had learned a long time ago, was useful. Anger could keep you warm when you were cold. It could keep you moving when you wanted to quit. It could turn pain into fuel. She forced herself to stand up and look around the shack. It wasn't much, but there were some useful things. In the corner, she found an old tackle box with a rusty knife inside. On a shelf, there was a coil of fishing line, some hooks, and, most important, a first aid kit that looked like it dated back to the 1980s. Sarah opened the kit with trembling hands. Inside were bandages, gauze, a bottle of iodine that was probably ancient, and a needle with thread for stitches. Not exactly modern medical equipment, but it would have to do. She peeled off her wet flight suit, wincing as the fabric pulled away from her injuries. Her ribs were already turning purple with bruises. There was a deep gash on her left shoulder where the handcuff had cut into her during the fall. Smaller cuts and scrapes covered her arms and legs. "Okay, Sarah," she said aloud, her voice hoarse. "You've done field medicine before. You can do this." She poured the iodine over the shoulder wound and had to bite down on her belt to keep from screaming. It burned like nothing she'd ever felt. But she knew it was necessary. Infection would kill her just as surely as Hayes's bullet would have. With shaking hands, she threaded the needle and began stitching the wound closed. Each push of the needle through her skin made her dizzy, but she forced herself to focus. Her father had taught her to stay calm under pressure. "Pain is temporary," he used to say, "but quitting lasts forever." By the time she finished bandaging herself up, the sun was higher in the sky. Sarah wrapped herself in an old tarp she found in the corner and finally let herself rest, just for a moment. But her mind wouldn't stop working. She needed to get off this island or coastline or wherever she was. She needed to get somewhere safe where she could think and plan. Most importantly, she needed to figure out who she could trust. Hayes had connections everywhere. If she went through normal military channels, word would get back to him before she could blink. She needed someone outside the system. Someone who owed more loyalty to the truth than to rank. And then she remembered Jennifer Chin. Jennifer had served with Sarah 5 years ago in Afghanistan. They'd flown missions together, saved each other's lives more than once. But Jennifer had left the military after their deployment, disillusioned by the politics and bureaucracy. Last Sarah had heard, Jennifer was working as a civilian contractor in Boston, doing security consultations. If anyone would help her, and if anyone could be trusted, it was Jennifer. But how to reach her? Sarah had no phone, no identification, no money. She was officially dead. She couldn't just walk into a police station or make a call from a public phone. Hayes would have people watching for any sign that she'd survived. Sarah spent the rest of that day and night in the shack, regaining her strength and thinking through her options. She caught rainwater in an old bucket to drink. She found some fishing supplies and managed to catch 2 small fish, which she ate raw because she couldn't risk making a fire that might be seen. It wasn't pleasant, but she'd survived on worse during survival training. On the second morning, she heard it, the sound of a boat engine. Sarah crept to the edge of the cliff and looked down. A small fishing boat was anchoring in the cove below, maybe 50 yards from where she'd washed up. 2 people were on board, a middle-aged man and woman, probably locals checking their nets. This was her chance. Sarah watched them for an hour, making sure they were alone, making sure they weren't talking on radios or phones. They worked quietly, hauling up nets, sorting fish, just 2 people doing honest work. She made her decision. Sarah climbed down the cliff, moving slowly to avoid falling, and walked across the beach toward their boat. The couple saw her coming and stopped what they were doing, staring at this woman in a torn flight suit with bandages covering her wounds. "Please," Sarah called out, her voice cracking. "Please, I need help." The man and woman exchanged looks. The woman said something to the man in what sounded like Portuguese. They were wary, obviously, but not threatening. Sarah stopped at the water's edge. "My name is Sarah. I was in an accident. My boat went down in the storm 2 nights ago. I need to get to the mainland. To Boston. I can pay you once we get there." It was a lie about the boat, but it was simpler than the truth. And right now, simple was what she needed. The man studied her for a long moment. Then he said in heavily accented English, "You are hurt. Come. We take you to doctor." "No," Sarah said quickly. "No doctors. No police. Just a ride to Boston. Please. I can explain later, but right now I just need help." The woman said something else in Portuguese. The man nodded slowly. "You are in trouble," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded. "Yes, but not the kind of trouble you're thinking. I'm not a criminal. I'm a soldier, and some very bad people think I'm dead. I need to stay dead for a little while longer." Maybe it was the way she said it. Maybe it was the desperation in her eyes. Or maybe these were just good people who saw someone in need. Whatever the reason, the man gestured to the boat. "Come. We take you to New Bedford. From there, you can get to Boston." Relief flooded through Sarah so intensely she almost fell over. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." The couple, their names were Carlos and Maria, she learned, gave her dry clothes, fed her fish stew, and asked no more questions. They seemed to understand that sometimes people need help and the details can wait. The boat ride to New Bedford took 6 hours. Sarah spent most of it below deck, staying out of sight. She used the time to think, to plan, to prepare herself for what came next. When they finally docked, night had fallen. The marina was quiet. Carlos gave her a $20 bill and directions to the bus station. Maria hugged her and whispered, "Be safe, soldier girl." Sarah caught the last bus to Boston, sitting in the very back with her hood up, watching every passenger who got on and off. It was nearly midnight when she finally reached the city. Boston looked different at night. The streets were mostly empty, just a few late-night workers and people heading home from bars. Sarah stuck to the shadows, moving through alleys and side streets, making her way across the city. She'd memorized Jennifer's address years ago, back when they'd exchanged information in case of emergencies. Sarah had never thought she'd actually use it. But here she was, standing outside a brownstone apartment building in Back Bay at 1 in the morning, hoping her old friend still lived there. She pressed the buzzer for apartment 3B and waited. Nothing. She pressed it again, longer this time. A sleepy, annoyed voice came through the intercom. "Who is this? Do you know what time it is?" Sarah's throat tightened. She recognized that voice. "Jennifer," she said softly. "It's Sarah Mitchell. I know you think I'm dead, but I'm not. And I really, really need your help." There was a long silence. Then, "Sarah?" Yeah, it's me. Another pause. Then the door buzzed open. Sarah climbed 3 flights of stairs, her legs trembling with exhaustion. The apartment door opened before she could knock. Jennifer Chin stood there in pajamas, her eyes wide with shock. "Oh my God," Jennifer whispered. "They said you were dead. There was a memorial service yesterday. I went to it. I cried at it." "I'm sorry," Sarah said. "But I need you to keep crying. As far as the world knows, I'm still dead. Can I come in?" Jennifer grabbed her and pulled her into the apartment, locking the door behind them. She turned on Sarah, her expression cycling through shock, confusion, and then anger. "What the hell is going on?" Sarah sank onto the couch. "It's a long story. I've got time." So Sarah told her everything. The corruption, the evidence, the betrayal, being thrown from the helicopter, the swim to shore. All of it. Jennifer listened in silence, her face growing harder with each detail. When Sarah finished, Jennifer was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Those bastards. Those absolute bastards. I need your help," Sarah said. "I need to expose what they did. But I can't do it alone. Hayes has too much power, too many connections. If I just show up and start making accusations, I'll disappear for real this time." Jennifer nodded slowly, her mind already working. "You need proof. Solid, undeniable proof that can't be buried or explained away." "I had proof," Sarah said miserably. "Files, recordings, everything. But it's all in my apartment back on the base. And there's no way I can get to it now." "Maybe not yourself," Jennifer said. "But I might know someone who can." She pulled out her phone and started scrolling through contacts. "I've kept in touch with some people from the old days. There's a guy, Marcus Webb, he was military police. Left the service same time I did, because he was sick of watching corruption go unpunished. He works private security now, but he's got access and skills." Hope flickered in Sarah's chest. "You think he'd help? For you? After what they did?" "Hell yes, he'll help." Jennifer looked at her watch. "It's late, but this can't wait. Let me make some calls." Over the next few hours, sitting in Jennifer's apartment drinking coffee and eating the first real meal she'd had in days, Sarah watched her friend work. Jennifer called Marcus, who was apparently in Virginia, and agreed to meet them. She called 2 other former military contacts who owed her favors. She set up secure communication channels and started mapping out a plan. By dawn, they had the outline of something that might actually work. "Okay," Jennifer said, surrounded by notes and laptop screens. "Here's what we're going to do. Marcus can get onto the base with his contractor credentials. He'll go to your apartment, he's good with locks, and retrieve whatever evidence you had stored there. Meanwhile, you and I are going to reach out to someone in the press. But not just anyone. We need a journalist with credibility, someone who can't be bought or intimidated." Sarah thought for a moment. "What about Rachel Green? She's been covering military corruption for the Boston Globe. She broke that story about the contractor fraud last year." "Perfect," Jennifer said. "I'll reach out to her through a secure channel. But here's the tricky part, Sarah. Once we start this, there's no going back. Hayes and his people will know you're alive. They'll come after you with everything they have. You sure you want to do this?" Sarah thought about the men who'd thrown her out of that helicopter. She thought about all the soldiers whose lives had been put at risk by Hayes's corruption. She thought about her father, who'd taught her that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. "I'm sure," she said. "All right then." Jennifer stood up and held out her hand. "Let's take these bastards down." Sarah shook her friend's hand, and for the first time since falling from that helicopter, she felt something besides pain and anger. She felt hope. The next 3 days were some of the longest of Sarah's life. She had to stay hidden in Jennifer's apartment, couldn't go outside, couldn't call anyone, couldn't do anything that might alert Hayes's people that she was alive. It was like being a ghost, watching the world continue without you. Jennifer had to go to work each day. Couldn't risk anyone getting suspicious by suddenly taking time off. So Sarah spent those hours alone, healing, planning, and trying not to drive herself crazy with worry. Marcus had agreed to help, but getting onto a military base and breaking into an officer's apartment was risky even for someone with his skills. If he got caught, he'd go to prison. And Sarah's evidence would be lost forever. On the 3rd night, Jennifer came home with news. Marcus called. "He's in." Sarah's heart leaped. "He got the files. He got something better." Jennifer set up her laptop on the kitchen table. "He found your evidence where you said it would be. But he also found that your apartment had been searched. Thoroughly. Someone went through everything, probably looking to make sure you hadn't left any copies of what you knew. Hayes, Sarah said bitterly. Probably. But here's the thing, they didn't find what Marcus found. You remember that loose floorboard in your bedroom closet? Sarah nodded. She'd discovered it years ago and used it as a hiding spot for important documents. Your instincts were good. You hid a USB drive under there with copies of everything. Bank records showing money transfers. Audio recordings of Hayes and the other officers discussing the sales. Flight manifests. Emails. Everything we need. Sarah felt like she could breathe for the first time in days. Marcus has it? He's driving up from Virginia now. Should be here tomorrow morning. And I've got more good news. Rachel Green from the Globe agreed to meet with us. But she wants to meet somewhere public, somewhere safe. She's been getting threats ever since her last corruption story. Smart, Sarah said. Where? Boston Public Library. Main branch. Day after tomorrow at noon. I figured a public place with lots of witnesses would be safest for everyone. Sarah nodded. And Hayes? Any word on what he's doing? Jennifer's expression darkened. That's the part I'm not sure you want to hear. There was a memorial service for you. Full military honors. Hayes gave a speech about what a brave officer you were. Talked about your service, your courage. He seemed really broken up about your tragic death. Sarah felt sick. He's a good liar. The best kind of evil usually is, Jennifer said quietly. But there's something else. I've been monitoring military communications through some of my old contacts. Hayes just got assigned to a new position. Some kind of special liaison role with the Department of Defense. Big promotion. More access. More power. They're rewarding him, Sarah said, her hands clenching into fists. For getting rid of me. Looks that way. Which means we need to move fast. Once he's in that new position, he'll have even more resources to cover his tracks and come after anyone who threatens him. That night, Sarah barely slept. She kept running through scenarios in her head. What if Rachel Green didn't believe them? What if Hayes found out she was alive before they could go public? What if Marcus got stopped on his way up from Virginia? But when morning came, so did Marcus. He was a tall man in his 40s with gray starting to show in his dark hair and the kind of steady, calm presence that came from years of dealing with dangerous situations. He greeted Sarah with a firm handshake and a slight smile. Captain Mitchell, good to see you're still alive. Just Sarah now, she said. I'm not sure I've got a rank anymore. You've got a rank in my book, Marcus said. He pulled out the USB drive and handed it to her. Everything was right where you said. I made 2 backup copies just in case. One's in a safe deposit box in Richmond. The other's with a lawyer friend who has instructions to release it if anything happens to any of us. Sarah took the drive like it was made of gold. Thank you, Marcus. You didn't have to risk yourself like this. Yeah, I did, he said simply. I served with good people who got hurt because of corruption like this. If I can help stop it, that's what I'm going to do. They spent the rest of that day going through the evidence, organizing it, making sure they had everything they needed. The files Sarah had collected were damning. Bank records showed nearly $8 million transferred to offshore accounts controlled by Hayes and 3 other officers. Major Tom Bradley, Colonel David Carter, and General Robert Stone. The audio recordings were even worse. Hayes's voice, clear and unmistakable, discussing prices for classified information. Carter laughing about how easy it was to manipulate shipping manifests. Stone talking about which politicians were friendly to their operation. This is going to blow up the entire chain of command, Marcus said, looking at the files with a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. A general, 2 colonels, a major, and these are just the ones we know about. No telling how many others are involved. That's why we need to make sure this goes public all at once, Jennifer said. If we just turn it over to military investigators, it'll get buried. But if we give it to the press first, they won't be able to hide it. The next morning, they prepared for the meeting with Rachel Green. Sarah dressed in civilian clothes Jennifer had bought for her. Jeans, a sweater, and a baseball cap to hide her face. She looked nothing like the military officer in the photos that had been shown at her memorial service. They decided all 3 of them would go to the meeting. Safety in numbers. Marcus would scout ahead to make sure it wasn't a trap. Jennifer would make the initial contact with Rachel. And Sarah would stay back until they were sure it was safe. The Boston Public Library was beautiful on that autumn afternoon. Leaves were turning gold and red in the trees outside. People walked past carrying coffee and books, living their normal lives, unaware that a few floors above them, A story was unfolding that would shake the military to its core. Marcus texted them. All clear. She's here alone. Reading room, 3rd floor. Jennifer and Sarah took the elevator up. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Everything came down to this. If Rachel Green believed them, if she was willing to run the story, they had a chance. If not, Rachel Green was younger than Sarah expected, maybe 30, with red hair pulled back in a ponytail and sharp, intelligent eyes behind glasses. She looked up as Jennifer approached, and Sarah saw her tense slightly, ready to run if needed. "Ms. Green," Jennifer said. "I'm Jennifer Chin. We spoke on the phone." Rachel nodded slowly. "You said you had information about military corruption. Something big. Bigger than you can imagine," Jennifer said. "But first, I need to introduce you to someone." She gestured to Sarah. Sarah stepped forward and pulled off her cap. Rachel's eyes went wide. You're Sarah Mitchell. But you're dead. I covered your memorial service 3 days ago. Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated," Sarah said with a grim smile. "And I'm here to tell you exactly why someone wanted everyone to think I was dead." They sat at a corner table, away from other people. For the next hour, Sarah told her story. She showed Rachel the evidence. The bank records. The audio recordings. Everything. Rachel listened without interrupting, taking notes, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When Sarah finished, Rachel sat back and let out a long breath. This is going to be the biggest military scandal in decades," she said. "You understand that if I publish this, your life will never be the same? You'll be in danger. You'll be the target of everyone who wants this buried." "I'm already in danger," Sarah said quietly. "And I'm already dead, remember? The way I see it, I've got nothing left to lose." Rachel studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Okay, I'm in. But we need to do this right. I'll need time to verify everything, to get comments from the military, to build the story properly. That's going to take at least a week." "A week," Sarah said. "Hayes could." "I know the risks," Rachel interrupted. "But if we rush this, they'll discredit it. They'll say it's fake, that you're a disgruntled soldier making things up. We need this to be bulletproof. And for that, I need time." Sarah looked at Jennifer and Marcus. They both nodded. "Okay," Sarah said. "A week. But we need to stay hidden until then. Hayes can't know I'm alive." "Agreed," Rachel said. She packed up her notes and stood. "I'll be in touch through Jennifer's secure line. In the meantime, you 3 need to disappear. Don't go back to either of your apartments. Don't use your phones. Don't contact anyone from your old lives." "Where should we go?" Jennifer asked. Rachel thought for a moment. "I have a friend who owns a cabin in New Hampshire. It's remote, off the grid. I'll set it up. You can wait there while I build the story." They left the library separately, at different times. Sarah felt exposed walking through the city, even with her disguise. Every person in uniform made her jump. Every police car made her want to hide. But they made it to Marcus's car without incident and started the drive north to New Hampshire. As they left Boston behind, Sarah watched the city fade in the side mirror. Somewhere in that city, in some office or meeting room, Colonel Hayes was probably celebrating his promotion, thinking he'd gotten away with it. He had no idea what was coming. Sarah smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who'd survived the worst and was ready to fight back. 1 week, she said softly. In 1 week, the whole world is going to know the truth. Jennifer reached over and squeezed her hand. And we're going to be there to see it. The cabin was perfect. Small, isolated, surrounded by woods, with no neighbors for miles. For the next week, the 3 of them became a team. Marcus used his contacts to gather additional evidence, finding more financial records and witnesses who'd seen suspicious activity. Jennifer worked on building a network of support, reaching out to other veterans who'd been pushed out for asking too many questions. And Sarah went through everything again and again, making sure every detail was perfect, every piece of evidence was solid. Rachel called every day with updates. She was working with her editors, getting lawyers involved, reaching out to the Pentagon for official comments. The military was stonewalling her, refusing to answer questions, which Rachel said was actually good for the story. It made them look guilty. On the 6th day, Rachel called with news that made Sarah's blood run cold. Hayes knows something's up, Rachel said. I requested comment from him specifically about the financial irregularities, and he's lawyered up. His attorney is threatening legal action against the Globe if we publish unsubstantiated allegations. More than that, I'm hearing through sources that Hayes is asking questions about you. Specifically, whether there's any chance you survived. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. He suspects. Maybe. Or maybe he's just paranoid. Either way, we need to move up the timeline. The story runs tomorrow morning, first thing. That means you need to be ready for what comes next. What comes next? Sarah asked. Everything, Rachel said simply. Press conferences. Interviews. Congressional hearings. The military will launch investigations. The FBI will get involved. And you'll be at the center of all of it. Are you ready for that? Sarah looked around the cabin at Jennifer and Marcus, these two people who'd risked everything to help her. She thought about all the soldiers who'd been betrayed by Hayes's corruption. She thought about her father's voice. Do the right thing, even when it's hard. I'm ready, she said. That night, none of them slept much. They sat around the cabin's fireplace, drinking coffee, running through scenarios, preparing for every possible outcome. They might arrest you, Marcus said bluntly. Even though you're the victim here, Hayes has powerful friends. They might try to flip the script, claim you stole classified information or went AWOL. Let them try, Sarah said. I've got the truth on my side. Truth doesn't always win, Marcus warned. Not right away, at least. But it wins eventually, Jennifer said firmly. That's what we have to believe. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Rachel called. It's live. The story just went up on the Globe's website. Front page. Military officers sold secrets for millions. Hero pilot murdered to silence her. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled up the article on Jennifer's laptop. There it was. Her story. Her evidence. Everything laid out in clear, precise detail that no one could deny. The response was immediate and explosive. Within an hour, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet in the country. By noon, it was international news. Sarah's photo, the one from her memorial service, was everywhere, along with the headline that she was alive and ready to testify. Her phone, a burner they'd picked up for this purpose, started ringing. News organizations, congressional staffers, military investigators. Everyone wanted to talk to her. Rachel had arranged for Sarah to give one exclusive interview that afternoon to a national news program that would air that evening. It would be Sarah's chance to tell her story in her own words, to show the world that she wasn't crazy or lying, that everything in the article was true. They drove to Boston in the early afternoon. Marcus had arranged security, 3 former military police officers who'd worked with him and could be trusted. They escorted Sarah into the news studio through a back entrance, away from the reporters already gathering out front. The interview was scheduled for 5 o'clock. Sarah sat in the makeup chair, watching herself transform from a woman on the run into someone who looked calm and professional. But inside, her heart was racing. You'll do great, Jennifer said, standing beside her. Just tell the truth. That's all you need to do. At 5 o'clock exactly, Sarah walked onto the set and sat down across from veteran journalist Michael Anderson. The cameras started rolling. Captain Sarah Mitchell, Michael said. 3 days ago, the military held a memorial service for you. They said you died in a training accident. But here you are, very much alive. Tell us what really happened. Sarah took a deep breath. And then she told her story. She told it all. The corruption she'd discovered. The evidence she'd gathered. The night Hayes and his men threw her from that helicopter. The swim to shore. Everything. She didn't cry, even though she wanted to. She kept her voice steady, kept her eyes on the camera, speaking directly to everyone watching. She wanted them to see that she wasn't some conspiracy theorist or troublemaker. She was a soldier who'd tried to do the right thing and almost died for it. When she finished, Michael was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're aware that Colonel Hayes and the other officers you've named are denying everything? They're calling you a liar and a traitor. Of course they are, Sarah said. What else can they say? The evidence is overwhelming. The bank records don't lie. The audio recordings don't lie. They can deny it all they want, but the truth is the truth. What do you want to happen now? Michael asked. Sarah looked directly into the camera. I want justice. Not just for me, but for every soldier whose life was put at risk by these men's greed. I want a real investigation, not a cover-up. And I want everyone who was part of this corruption to be held accountable, no matter how high up they are. The interview aired at 8 o'clock that night. By 9, it had been viewed online more than 5 million times. By midnight, the Pentagon had announced a full investigation. By morning, the FBI had opened a criminal case. And 3 days later, federal agents arrested Colonel Richard Hayes as he tried to board a private plane to the Cayman Islands. Sarah watched the news coverage from Rachel's apartment, where she'd been staying under protection. She watched them put handcuffs on Hayes, the same kind of handcuffs he'd put on her, and lead him away. "How does it feel?" Jennifer asked. Sarah thought about it. "Not as good as I thought it would," she admitted. "I'm glad he's arrested. But it doesn't undo what happened. It doesn't bring back the time I lost or erase what he did." "No," Jennifer agreed. "But it stops him from doing it to anyone else. That counts for something." Over the next weeks and months, the investigation grew. Major Bradley, Colonel Carter, and General Stone were all arrested. Dozens of other officers were questioned. The corruption went even deeper than Sarah had realized. Bribes, kickbacks, falsified reports, all of it in service of making a few men very rich. Sarah testified before Congress. She testified at the court-martials. She told her story so many times she could recite it in her sleep. It was exhausting. It was painful. There were times she wished she could just disappear again, go back to being anonymous. But every time she felt that way, she'd get a letter from a soldier thanking her for having the courage to speak up. Or she'd hear about a new policy being implemented to prevent this kind of corruption. And she'd remember why it had all been worth it. 6 months after that story broke, Sarah found herself standing outside a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. It was a cold January morning, the kind where your breath makes clouds in the air and you can't quite get warm no matter how many layers you wear. Inside that courthouse, Colonel Richard Hayes was about to go on trial. Sarah hadn't seen him since that night on the helicopter. She'd seen his face on television, in newspapers, in her nightmares. But she hadn't been in the same room with him. Part of her was terrified. Part of her couldn't wait. Jennifer stood beside her, along with Marcus and Rachel. They'd become her family over these months, these people who'd risked everything to help her. "You ready for this?" Marcus asked. "No," Sarah said honestly. "But I'm going to do it anyway." The courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the halls. Other soldiers who'd been affected by Hayes's corruption had come to watch justice be served. Sarah walked through them all with her head high, refusing to hide or look ashamed. She was the victim here. She was the hero. She had to keep reminding herself of that. The courtroom was imposing, all dark wood and American flags and serious-faced people in suits. Sarah took her seat in the witness gallery, and that's when she saw him. Colonel Hayes sat at the defense table in a civilian suit, his military career stripped away. He looked older than she remembered. Grayer. Thinner. But when his eyes met hers across that courtroom, they held the same cold calculation they'd had that night on the helicopter. He didn't look away. Neither did she. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Sarah had to listen to Hayes's lawyers try to tear her apart, claiming she'd fabricated evidence, that she was mentally unstable, that she'd stolen classified information, and was now trying to cover it up by making up stories about corruption. It was brutal, but the evidence didn't lie. Bank records, audio recordings, testimony from other soldiers who'd witnessed suspicious activities, documents that Marcus had uncovered. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. Hayes and his co-conspirators had sold military secrets for years, and when Sarah discovered it, they'd tried to murder her. On the 15th day of the trial, it was Sarah's turn to testify. She walked to the witness stand with her heart pounding. The bailiff swore her in. She sat down and looked out at the crowded courtroom, at all those faces waiting to hear her story. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Amanda Chin, stood up. "Captain Mitchell, can you tell the court about the night of November 14th? Sarah took a breath. "That was the night Colonel Hayes and his men threw me out of a helicopter." She told the story again, every detail. The storm, the handcuffs, the betrayal, the fall, the way she'd fought to survive. When she finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Hayes's lawyers looked uncomfortable. Then it was their turn to cross-examine her. Hayes's lead attorney, a man named Robert Dalton, who probably cost more per hour than Sarah used to make in a month, stood up with a sympathetic smile that made her skin crawl. "Captain Mitchell, you've been through a traumatic experience. No one is denying that. But isn't it possible that in your trauma, you've misremembered some details? Confused things?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "You fell from a helicopter in a storm. You hit the ocean. You nearly drowned. That kind of trauma can affect memory." "My memory is fine," Sarah interrupted. "I remember every single second of that night, including the moment Colonel Hayes looked me in the eye and pushed me out that door." You were in shock. You were terrified. The mind can play tricks. The bank records aren't a trick, Sarah said, her voice rising. The audio recordings aren't a trick. The testimony from a dozen other witnesses isn't a trick. My memory might be questioned, but the evidence is clear. Dalton tried a different approach. Isn't it true that you had filed complaints about Colonel Hayes before? That you had a personal grudge against him? I filed complaints because he was breaking the law, Sarah said. If that's a grudge, then I'm guilty. I'm guilty of wanting officers to follow the same rules they expect soldiers to follow. You were passed over for promotion twice. Because I refused to go along with the corruption, Sarah shot back. Yes, I was angry about that. I was angry that good soldiers were being pushed aside while criminals got promoted. If wanting justice makes me biased, then I'm biased. The cross-examination went on for hours. Dalton tried everything, questioning her motives, her memory, her character. But Sarah didn't break. Every attack just made her more determined to tell the truth. Finally, the prosecutor asked her one last question. Captain Mitchell, knowing what you know now, knowing everything you went through, would you do it again? Would you still report the corruption? Sarah didn't hesitate. Yes. 1,000 times yes. Because if people like me don't stand up to corruption, who will? If we just stay quiet and go along because it's easier, because it's safer, then we're just as guilty as the people actually doing wrong. She looked directly at Hayes. I took an oath to protect this country. So did he. The difference is I kept my oath. When she stepped down from the witness stand, her legs were shaking. But she'd done it. She'd told the truth, and she'd stood strong. The trial continued for another week. Other witnesses testified. Experts analyzed the financial records. FBI agents explained how they'd traced the money. And then it was time for closing arguments. The prosecutor laid it all out, the evidence, the testimony, the clear pattern of corruption and murder. The defense wants you to believe that Captain Mitchell is confused, vindictive, lying. But the evidence tells a different story. It tells the story of a woman who discovered something terrible and almost died for it. It tells the story of officers who betrayed everything they swore to protect. And it tells the story of justice that almost died in the Atlantic Ocean that night, but survived. Hayes' attorney did his best. He talked about reasonable doubt. He suggested alternative explanations. He painted Hayes as a decorated officer being destroyed by false accusations. But watching the jury's faces, Sarah could tell they weren't buying it. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Sarah spent those days unable to eat, unable to sleep, just pacing and waiting and trying not to think about what would happen if Hayes was found not guilty. On the 3rd day, the jury came back. Has the jury reached a verdict? The judge asked. We have, Your Honor. Sarah's heart stopped. On the charge of attempted murder, how do you find? Guilty. The word seemed to echo through the courtroom. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. On the charge of conspiracy to commit treason, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. Guilty on all 23 counts. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered. Others cried. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. And Sarah just sat there, tears streaming down her face, as 6 months of fear and pain and anger finally released. Hayes' face had gone white. He stared at the jury like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Like he'd been so certain of his power, his connections, his ability to escape consequences, that the idea of actually being held accountable was incomprehensible. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later. Hayes was remanded to custody immediately. As the marshals put handcuffs on him, those same handcuffs, he looked back at Sarah one last time. She expected to see hatred. But what she saw was worse. She saw nothing. Empty eyes. A man who'd sold his soul for money and couldn't even understand what he'd lost. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Sarah. She made a brief statement, her voice shaking but strong. Today, justice was served. But this isn't just about one man or one case. This is about holding people in power accountable. It's about making sure that no one is above the law. And it's about honoring the soldiers who serve this country honestly by refusing to tolerate those who don't. That night, Sarah went back to Jennifer's apartment. She still didn't have a place of her own, was still figuring out what her life looked like now, and collapsed on the couch. You did it, Jennifer said, handing her a beer. It's really over. Hayes is done, Sarah agreed. But the other trials are just starting. Bradley, Carter, Stone, they all go to trial in the next few months. You going to testify at those too? If they need me to, yes. Jennifer sat down beside her. You know you don't have to, right? You've done enough. More than enough. You could walk away now and no one would blame you. Sarah thought about it. It was tempting. God, it was tempting. She could leave DC, go somewhere quiet, try to build a normal life. Stop being Sarah Mitchell, the whistleblower. Stop being the woman who fell from the sky. Just be Sarah again. But then she thought about all the soldiers who'd written to her, thanking her for her courage. She thought about the young officers who were now inspired to stand up to corruption because she'd shown it was possible. She thought about her father, who'd taught her that heroes aren't people who never get scared. They're people who do the right thing even when they're terrified. No, she said finally. I can't walk away. Not yet. These men need to face justice, all of them. And if my testimony helps make that happen, then I need to be there. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met, Jennifer said quietly. I'm not strong, Sarah said. I'm just stubborn. There's a difference. They both laughed, and for a moment, everything felt almost normal. Almost. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood in that same courtroom as the judge sentenced Colonel Richard Hayes to 40 years in federal prison. No parole. No early release for good behavior. 40 years. Hayes was 53 years old. He'd be 93 before he was free. Sarah felt no joy at the sentence. No satisfaction. Just a quiet sense that the world had tilted back toward balance, even if just a little bit. As they led Hayes away, he looked at Sarah one last time. This time he spoke. Just 2 words. I'm sorry. Sarah didn't respond. She just watched him go, this man who'd tried to kill her, this man who'd betrayed everything he was supposed to stand for. And she thought, I'm sorry too. Sorry that you made the choices you did. Sorry that you threw away honor for money. Sorry that it came to this. But mostly she thought, I'm glad I survived to see this day. Outside, the winter sun was shining. Sarah stood on the courthouse steps and breathed in the cold air. Jennifer and Marcus flanked her, and Rachel was there too, along with dozens of other people who'd supported her through this ordeal. What now? Marcus asked. Sarah smiled. Now I figure out how to live again. Spring came to DC like a promise kept. Cherry blossoms bloomed along the tidal basin. The air warmed. And slowly, carefully, Sarah Mitchell began to figure out who she was in this new life. The trials continued. Major Bradley got 30 years. Colonel Carter got 35. General Stone, the highest-ranking officer involved, got 50 years. Each verdict felt like another weight lifting off Sarah's shoulders. But the trials were only part of the healing. Sarah had to figure out what came next. The Air Force had offered to reinstate her with full honors, but something about going back to that life felt wrong. Too many memories. Too much pain. The uniform that had once made her proud now reminded her of betrayal. So she did something she'd never imagined she'd do. She resigned. It wasn't an easy decision. Being a pilot had been her entire identity since she was 18 years old. It was who she was. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe she'd been so focused on being a soldier that she'd forgotten how to be Sarah. What are you going to do now? Jennifer asked her one morning over coffee. They were sitting on Jennifer's balcony, watching the city wake up. I don't know, Sarah admitted. For the first time in my life, I genuinely don't know. And you know what? That's kind of exciting. Over the next few months, Sarah started exploring possibilities she'd never had time for before. She took a ceramics class and discovered she was terrible at it, but loved it anyway. She started running again, not to stay in military shape, but just because it felt good. She read books that had nothing to do with aviation or tactics. She learned to cook something besides MREs and instant noodles. Small things. Normal things. The kind of things that most people take for granted, but felt like miracles to someone who'd spent half a year fighting for justice, and the other half learning to be human again. But Sarah also knew she couldn't completely walk away from the military world. There was still work to be done. She started getting calls from other soldiers, men and women who'd witnessed corruption or abuse and didn't know what to do about it. They'd heard about Sarah's case and wanted advice. Wanted to know if speaking up was worth it. At first, Sarah tried to just give them information and send them on their way. But she quickly realized that wasn't enough. These people needed more than advice. They needed support. They needed protection. They needed someone who understood what they were going through. So Sarah did something crazy. She started a nonprofit organization. She called it the Integrity Project. Its mission was simple: support military whistleblowers and help expose corruption in the armed forces. Provide legal assistance. Connect people with journalists. Offer protection to those who came forward. Jennifer signed on immediately as the operations director. Marcus joined as security consultant. Rachel became an advisor. And dozens of other former military personnel who'd been pushed out for refusing to go along with corruption volunteered to help. They set up an office in a small building in Arlington. Nothing fancy, just desks, computers, phones. But to Sarah, it felt like home in a way nothing had since that night on the helicopter. The first case they took on was a Navy lieutenant who'd discovered financial fraud in shipbuilding contracts. With Sarah's help and Rachel's journalism connections, they exposed the fraud and saved taxpayers $30 million. The second case involved an Army sergeant who'd reported sexual harassment and been retaliated against. The Integrity Project got her story told and forced the Army to change its policies. Case by case, soldier by soldier, Sarah was making a difference. But it wasn't always easy. There were setbacks. There were times when the powerful people they were fighting back pushed back hard. Sarah received threats. Her office was broken into twice. There were days she wanted to quit. On one particularly hard day, a case they'd worked on for months had fallen apart because a key witness recanted under pressure. Sarah sat in her office staring at the wall, wondering if any of it mattered. Jennifer knocked on her door. "Can I come in?" Sarah nodded. "I know today was rough," Jennifer said, sitting down. "But you need to remember something. A year ago, you were lying in a fishing shack wondering if you'd survive the night. 6 months ago, you were fighting for your own justice. And now you're fighting for other people. You've built something real here, Sarah. Something that matters. But we lost today," Sarah said quietly. "We lost one battle," Jennifer corrected. "The war's not over. It's never over. That's the thing about fighting corruption. It's not something you win once and it's done. It's something you have to keep fighting every single day. That's what makes it worth doing." Sarah looked at her friend. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from the best," Jennifer said with a smile. As spring turned to summer, the Integrity Project grew. They took on bigger cases. They made more enemies among the corrupt and more friends among the honest. They saved careers and exposed criminals. And Sarah found that for the first time since that night on the helicopter, she felt like herself again. Not the person she'd been before. That Sarah was gone, left behind in the Atlantic Ocean. But a new Sarah. Stronger. Wiser. More determined. 1 year after the Hayes verdict, Sarah was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy graduation. She almost said no. Walking onto a military base still brought back difficult memories. But she thought about all those young officers about to begin their careers, and she knew she had to do it. Standing at that podium, looking out at hundreds of new lieutenants in their uniforms, Sarah felt a mix of emotions. Pride. Sadness. Hope. "A year ago," she began, "I was declared dead. The military held a memorial service for me. My fellow officers said wonderful things about my service. And then they went back to their lives, thinking I was gone. But I'm not gone. I'm right here. And I'm here to tell you something important. You're about to enter a profession that demands everything from you. Your time. Your safety. Sometimes your life. It's a profession built on honor, on integrity, on the idea that we serve something bigger than ourselves. But here's what they don't always tell you at graduation. You're going to encounter people who've forgotten what those words mean. People who use their rank and authority for personal gain. People who put their own interests above the mission, above their soldiers, above everything they swore to protect. When that happens, not if, but when, you're going to have a choice. You can stay quiet, keep your head down, tell yourself it's not your problem. That's the easy path. That's the path that keeps you safe. Or you can speak up. You can do the hard thing. You can be the person who stands up and says, "This is wrong, and I won't be part of it." I won't lie to you, that path is dangerous. I almost died for choosing it. I lost friends. I lost my career. I spent months fighting just to be heard. But I'd do it again, in a heartbeat. Because at the end of the day, you have to be able to look at yourself in the mirror. You have to be able to live with the choices you made. So my advice to you as you start your military careers is this. Remember why you're here. Remember the oath you're about to take. And when the time comes, when you're faced with that choice between easy and right, I hope you'll choose right. Even if it costs you everything. Because that's what integrity means. Not doing the right thing when it's easy, but doing it when it's hard, when it's dangerous, when everything inside you is screaming to just stay quiet and stay safe. A year ago, some men threw me out of a helicopter because I threatened their corruption. They thought they could silence me. They thought they could make me disappear. They were wrong. And if you stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything, you'll find that you're stronger than you ever imagined. You'll find people who believe in you. You'll find that the truth, no matter how hard people try to bury it, always finds a way to rise. Just like I did. The applause was thunderous. Sarah saw tears in some faces, determination in others. And she really hoped, that her words would matter when these young officers faced their own tests. After the ceremony, dozens of new lieutenants came up to thank her, to shake her hand, to tell her she was their hero. Sarah felt uncomfortable with that word. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd done what needed to be done and gotten lucky enough to survive it. But if her story could inspire even one person to stand up to corruption, then maybe it was worth everything she'd been through. That night, Sarah sat on the balcony of her new apartment. She'd finally gotten her own place, and looked up at the stars. She thought about how different her life was from a year ago. How she'd gone from a decorated pilot to a dead woman to a whistleblower to... What was she now? She was Sarah Mitchell. Not captain. Not hero. Not victim. Just Sarah. And that was enough. Her phone rang. It was Jennifer. "Hey," Sarah answered. "What's up?" "Just got word on a new case. Army captain in Texas who's discovered evidence of recruitment fraud. She wants to come forward, but she's scared." "Tell her we'll help," Sarah said immediately. "I figured you'd say that. Conference call tomorrow at 9. I'll be there." Sarah hung up and smiled. A year ago, she'd been fighting for her own justice. Now she was fighting for others. She thought about Colonel Hayes, sitting in a federal prison cell, probably still not understanding what he'd done wrong. She thought about the soldiers whose lives had been saved because that corruption had been exposed. She thought about all the young officers she'd spoken to today who might face similar challenges. The work wasn't done. It would never be done. There would always be corruption to fight, whistleblowers to protect, truths to expose. But Sarah was ready for it. She'd fallen from the sky and survived. She'd nearly drowned and made it to shore. She'd taken on the most powerful people in the military and won. Whatever came next, she could handle it. The stars above her seemed brighter than usual. Maybe it was just her imagination. Or maybe it was hope. Sarah raised her coffee cup in a silent toast to her father, who'd taught her courage. To Jennifer and Marcus and Rachel, who'd stood by her. To all the soldiers fighting for integrity in a world that didn't always value it. And to herself. For surviving. For standing up. For refusing to stay silent even when silence would have been safer. "Here's to the fall," she whispered to the night sky. "And to the rise that follows." The wind picked up, warm and gentle, carrying the smell of spring flowers and possibility. And somewhere in that wind, Sarah could almost hear her father's voice saying what he'd always said when she was scared. "You're stronger than you know, baby girl. You always have been." Sarah smiled and went inside. Tomorrow there would be more work to do. More people to help. More corruption to fight. But tonight she would rest. She would sleep without nightmares for the first time in a year. She would dream not of falling, but of flying. And in the morning, she would wake up ready to fight again. Because that's what survivors do. They get up. They keep going. They turn their pain into purpose. And they never, ever stop fighting for what's right. The end.